when you're praying, and I'm sure you've experienced this, that seems to be when your mind wants to do the most racing about mundane things that don't really matter. But when you're praying, you're supposed to be in the direct presence of God. You're supposed to have a dialogue with God, heart to heart, right? So this, I think, is what it means for your mind to descend into your heart. And so, yes, I do think I've gotten much better from when I was just becoming a Christian at praying, and in knowing how to pray in a way that isn't just saying stuff, whether it be my words or in my head, but actually engaging with God as a person.
Hey guys, just a brief note before this episode. It is somewhat of a more philosophical conversation, and we do try to define terms wherever possible. However, there may be a term or two that you're unfamiliar with, and I would just encourage you to listen through the episode because I still think it makes a fair amount of sense. And if there is something that you get hung up on, you should be able to Google it and find out the definition. And I hope that you enjoy this episode. Okay, welcome everyone to the Orthodox Christian podcast. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Treydon Lunot. And for everyone watching or listening, Treydon, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself and tell everyone what you spend your time doing?
Hi, yeah, so my name is Trey, and I primarily run the channel telosbound, or at least that's primarily what I'm known for. Telosbound is a channel a YouTube channel I started 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, and I started just talking about philosophy. But already when I started the channel in September 2021, I was already a Christian and an Orthodox Christian. I believe I was already a catechumen, but I didn't want to talk about theology online until I was actually in the church and received the blessing and stuff like that. So uh, that's my channel, telosbound. Again, it started off as philosophy, and now I do almost exclusively theology, biblical theology, patristics, and also still engaging with modern philosophy now, but from a explicitly Christian perspective. So that's me, and that's basically what I do that's relevant to whatever we're going to be talking about here.
Awesome. So, in terms of your upbringing, tell us a little bit about that, whether that was within a church of some kind, and then bring us forward to the place where you encountered the Orthodox Church.
So I grew up as a non-Christian, basically secular. My parents would talk about God and heaven sometimes, but no mention of Jesus in particular. It seemed to be just like a very loose sort of cultural deism that my parents inherited. So I grew up with no real knowledge of Christianity, no experience being in a church. I never went to a church service before I first went to St. Herman's, which I don't know if I can talk about
Yeah, yeah.
locations here, but we both live near each other. So you've been there, and that's where I met you actually. So I had no experience with Christianity. And for some reason, I became a militant atheist when I was about 12. And usually, when someone becomes a militant atheist, there's a reason behind that that has to do with religion. Like they had a bad experience with Christianity. They were raised by fundamentalist parents and they were restricted. And then they have this atheist phase and stuff where they rebel against their parents and all this. That wasn't me. I was not rebelling against anyone except for God at the time. Not that I really knew much about God in the first place. And I was very young. Again, I was 12, 13. And that was the beginning, ironically, of my sort of intellectual curiosity. I didn't care about any, like I was just a kid before this. And the beginning of my intellectual consciousness, if you want to say that, that's kind of pretentious, but it was getting into atheism. And atheism got me into politics. And I joined this incredible community at the time called Politigram, which was a bunch of young people on Instagram talking about politics. And from there, I spent many years in there. That was my high school years. I spent a lot of time in high school just debating people online and stuff on Instagram. And through that, I found philosophy. And it was through engaging with philosophy, specifically modern philosophy, people like Nietzsche, Zizek, Heidegger, these sort of philosophers, especially continental philosophers, whose work they're sort of known for being super jargony, and they love rhetoric and they love to write in a very difficult way. But I get a lot out of them. And it's especially now as a Christian, I love looking back, reading them, seeing what they got wrong, why they got it wrong, following through the logic of their thinking, and seeing how it can be integrated within a Christian worldview. So that's what I do on my channel. So it was seeing certain ideas in certain modern philosophers, and seeing coming to certain deadlocks with it, certain problems and contradictions that couldn't be solved. That really led me to Christianity, and it led me specifically to Orthodox Christianity, not for any philosophical reason. I was more so convinced on a historical and liturgical basis when it came to orthodoxy. But in terms of the philosophy, the idea of the Trinity, where you have one and the many that exist together, and that God himself, the first cause, the first principle of all reality, he himself is this unity of the one and the many. That in essence was the philosophical reason for my conversion to Christianity, because all of the problems I seem to run into with just secular philosophy was problems of the one and the many, or the self and other people, and how we can know other people, engage with the world around us. I always had problems with solipsism, and just on a philosophical level, how do we get around solipsism? And for various reasons, pretty quickly, I was going to say slowly, but pretty quickly, actually, I realized that the understanding of reality, the way the one and the many works, all of this stuff in Christianity within a Trinitarian and incarnational worldview, it really fits together and really works. So that was the beginning of my intellectual conversion. And for a few months, I was just looking into what type of Christianity I wanted to get into, and I found Orthodox YouTube and Orthodox community on Instagram as well. And I pretty quickly became convinced of orthodoxy. And from there, I just pretty quickly started attending St. Herman's. I met Father Lawrence, and yeah, I got baptized. And there hasn't been much since my conversion. There hasn't been anything crazy that's really happened aside from my channel kind of growing and becoming more invested in theology online and stuff like that. But yeah, that's my story. I went from an atheist to Orthodox Christian, and there is like a line, a very squiggly line, but there is a line connecting that moment to my conversion.
And over what time frame was that?
I became convinced when I was 17, and now I am about to turn 20 in February. So it's been 3 years now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So it was like a 5-year journey from when you encountered atheism to encountering orthodoxy, and then 3
Yeah.
years in the
Yeah.
church, approximately.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, I've got some questions, but also just some definitions, so
Sure.
everyone can follow along with what you just said. So if you can define deism, solipsism, and continental philosophers, because those are some more slightly technical terms that some people
Right.
might not be familiar
Right.
with.
Deism. So deism is a belief that became popular around the Enlightenment period, so 17th, 18th century, and it was a belief of, it seems, quite a few of the founding fathers of America, which is a belief in a God, but not a belief in religion, and not really a belief in a personal God who is engaging with his creation. So deists typically don't accept that the Bible is a revelation of God, because obviously in the Bible, it's a God who loves, who is jealous, who is wrathful, who gives blessings and all this stuff. Deists don't really believe this. Deism, if I'm remembering correctly, the philosophical reason for the development of deism is because people around this time still saw the necessity of a creator, of a first cause, whatever you want to call it. And they did see that God was logical, but they couldn't accept all of this moralistic, ancient notions of a God who engages with creation and makes covenants and punishes and all this stuff. So that's what deism is, and that's what my family basically holds to without knowing. They don't really believe in a personal God. They don't believe in a God who became incarnate, but they do believe in some sort of God and some sort of afterlife. So that's what I meant by deism. Now, solipsism is the belief that there is nothing else in the world except for you. And I do think solipsism, it's not something that can just be dismissed, because I do think it actually has a place within even the spiritual life of a person, especially a Christian. You will have fathers who talk about this feeling of isolation, of being the only one, of being abandoned by God even. the dark night of the soul, whatever you want to call it. I'm not saying that we can affirm solipsism as true, but I do think there's a place for this feeling of isolation, of being the only one, of being alienated from others and from God. There's a reason for this, and there's a reason why it has become a philosophical idea. And I think it's because there's something within us, within our spirit, within us as persons, that makes solipsism something that we could experience. You can feel this isolation, and I honestly think that reality without God is solipsism. So if that's how this is my approach to philosophy in general. Obviously, we cannot say as Christians that solipsism is true. Obviously, I affirm that you exist. I affirm that God exists. Others around me exist. But we can say that there is a place for this solipsism, and even for the arguments made for solipsism. And this gets a little more tricky. Like, a philosophical argument for solipsism is the fact that, well, whenever I'm encountering you from the perspective of my own mind. You're coming through my senses and into my mind. How can I know that this isn't just a creation of my own mind? How do I know that you're really distinct from me? And I think this is a real philosophical problem. And I think the notion of the Trinity, where the one, myself, is not in tension with you, but I'm always already in communion with you, in relation with you. This is an idea that really solves it at a philosophical level. But not to get too deep into that, that's what solipsism is. It's the belief that you are the only one in existence. And while it's not a Christian belief, I do think there is insights that solipsis and solipsistic philosophy has that can be brought into Christianity. And then I think the last thing you mentioned was continental philosophy. And that's a broad term that captures, well, it's called continental philosophy because most continental philosophers come from Germany. So you have people like Hegel, Kant, Heidegger, Nietzsche. These are all continental philosophers, and they're juxtaposed with analytic philosophers. And analytic philosophers, typically they're English or American. And you don't have to be, obviously, but the English philosophers, especially in the 20th century, people like Bertrand Russell, they would be categorized as analytic philosophers, and they focus on logic and math and stuff like this. What seems to be more rational and able to be systematized. That's what analytic philosophers like. But then you read someone like Hegel, and you don't find this in there. You don't find like logical formulas coming to truth, like truth formulas and stuff like that. It's for Hegel, basically, his phenomenology of spirit is almost like a piece of literature, but a philosophical literature, philosophical prose. It's not systematized. There aren't logical argument, like there are arguments made, but they're not like precise and defined. And if you read Nietzsche as well, he's a great orator. He's a good a rhetorician. He's good at presenting ideas in poetic and eloquent ways. Heidegger is the same. So that's the difference between the continental philosophers and the analytic philosophers. And I personally, not that I would disparage analytic philosophy. Personally, continental philosophy has been more interesting and something I've engaged with more throughout my life.
Awesome. So actually, one follow-up question, just when you mentioned solipsism as a potential path, essentially, that people can walk down, it does make sense in so far as evil is like a scattering or like a disintegration and falling away from the one, essentially. Right. And you see that like in Israel's story where they stray from God, and then you've got these judges that appear on the scene, and then Israel's tribes start to like fight among themselves, and sort of where that ends is the exile of Israel into these nations. And so you get what once was unified into these little units, and the extension of that is just the individual on their own, apart from anything. And I think that also connects with like when there's the demoniac that Christ encounters, and his name is Legion, and it's like there's just like so much disintegration that's part of this person. So
it's funny you mentioned that, because I've written on Legion specifically. I've done a video on it too, talking about this exactly. And I love what you're saying there, because in the Bible, there is a weird correlation between, we could say, self-reference, or like the solipsistic idea of enclosing yourself within yourself, and division. And it's a weird correlation because from just a superficial perspective, they seem to be opposites, right? How is reverting to myself, enclosing myself within me, dividing me? Well, the reason why is because the way you truly find yourself in Christianity isn't through self-reflection or self-relation, but it's through knowing God, because God contains he is your end. As Maximus the Confessor talks about, he is the telos. Telos means the goal, the end to which that fulfills our being. And so to truly know yourself and to truly become what you're meant to be, it's not through any self-referential mode, but it's through communion. It's through exiting yourself and moving towards God, moving towards other people as well. That's why the 2 commandments that Jesus gives is to love God above all else and to love your neighbor as yourself. So there you have the principle of communion at the hierarchical level, man and God, and then at the horizontal level, between men and women and people. So in the Bible, there is a weird correlation here. Like, a best example I would say is Legion, where you have a single person who suddenly, when Jesus says to this person, tell me your name or give me the truth of yourself, you have this schizophrenic fracturing into Legion, where suddenly the pronouns shift from I to or you in the singular to the plural they. Legion, they came out of the man, and all this stuff. And I think this just shows the way in which this solipsistic self-isolation, which I think correlates with sin, as you were saying, and pride, this removal of yourself from communion, because of our created nature and the fact that we only exist through participating in God. When we try to do this sinful self relation and self-reversion, this leads to the paradoxical collapse of our own self, the splitting of our own self, because what we are, to find our true identity, is paradoxically, again, from a non-Christian perspective, is to exit yourself and to move towards towards the otherness of God. And yeah, so I really like what you're saying there. That really overlaps with a lot of the stuff I talk about on my channel.
Yeah. Well, and I do want to return to your story in a second, but I can't help myself from doing another reflection on this Legion story.
Please.
So another thing that's interesting is that like what makes sense of what you're talking about is that we are beings that participate in existence, and that existence is not something inherent to us. And so we need to be in communion with God, who is the one who necessarily exists and holds all things in existence in order for us to sustain being. And that when we drift away from God, it is its own punishment because we are drifting away from existence. And then in that story of Legion, what I really love about it is the symbolism in terms of how evil destroys itself, because the demons asked to be sent into the pigs, and pigs were unclean for Jews and therefore distant from God. And the pigs rush into the water, and water was a symbol of evil in the sense of the flood. And so you have this lovely picture of different characterizations of evil coalescing and destroying themselves, which is essentially what happens when you drift from God.
Right. And last thing I'll say on this, because I know you want to move on, but the reason why the demons flee to the sea is because like what's the impetus of that is the presence of God in Christ. Obviously, when Christ makes himself known and then he makes this command, he forces them to say who they are, to declare who they are, to no longer be able to hide in the shadows, but here, I am the light and I have come to shine my light upon you. Well, this light is the same as the fire of hell, right? And it burns the demons. And the encounter with God for demonic realities is it destroys them. They have to flee. That is why, as you're saying, it's a punishment in itself, because it's to sever yourself from God is to sever yourself from the principle of your own being. But at the same time, it is the free choice, and this is affirmed throughout Orthodoxy, Orthodox theology. It's a free choice because it's a painful experience. Like, for example, if there's something very shameful you did to someone else, and you know you need to apologize to that person, and you don't, and you just keep bearing it within you. If one day this just gets exposed to the public, this is it's a bad you didn't want this, you weren't prepared for it, and you wish it didn't happen. But that's what the light of God does. It reveals the truth. And the demons, we can't really understand their subjectivity or their consciousness, but they are so fully aligned against the truth that when he makes himself present, they have to flee. And the demons, Legion specifically says, why have you come before the appointed time? The appointed time, I'm not exactly sure. Is that the very end, or is it some judgment before then? I'm not sure. in any case, what they're saying is, you have come to cast us away and do what? Well, I think the implication is that when God makes himself present, the power that demons hold over the world is taken away. Because what is Christ's goal? Well, according to St. Maximus, it's to reclaim the whole cosmos for himself. So in the Old Testament period, especially, demons had control over the world. Like, Jesus will go from town to town and be like, there's a demoniac here, there's a demoniac there. I know there's demoniac still, but I don't think it was like that. We don't encounter it like that anymore. And I think that just testifies to a real change that Christ made in the world. So he was encountering demons left and right. And it was just a given for these people that there were demon-possessed people. But what Christ comes to do is to reclaim the creation for himself. And there is no space for the devil and Christ in the same place. So where Christ comes, the demons have to go. And what you were saying about the sea and the symbolism of the sea also represents, in sort of the symbolic biblical cosmology, the sea is sort of the outside, the fringe, the edge of the universe. And this is why they're also correlated in the context of Israel. The seas are correlated with the Gentiles over and over again in the Old Testament. So when the demons are cast into the swine, which, as you said, are already unclean, and then sent into the abyss, I don't think this is their final judgment, obviously. But what it is it's a symbol of the final judgment, which consists of God making his presence known, and this casting out those who rebel against him into the outer darkness. Essentially, I think that's ultimately what the sea symbolizes, is this outer darkness of persons who have withdrawn away from God while he has made himself present. So I said a lot there. I'm sorry. I know you want to move on, but
no, that's good. That's good. That's good. And also, it's a lovely symbol of like Pharaoh rushing into the sea and then being flooded, and that was his will. And so there's the nice connection with evil willing its own destruction. Anyway, so in terms of your own story with atheism and then political philosophy or politics and then philosophy, what was the attraction to each of these things, if you had to summarize it?
So for atheism, I honestly don't really know. I can't even go back. All I can remember is just my feeling of Christians are dumb. Like, that's all I thought. Christians are stupid. And for some reason, I never cared about Islam. It was always Christianity for me. I think that's providential. And I think it's sort of similar for people who grew up in Christian, quote unquote, countries. But yeah, I don't really know why. I just had this feeling that Christianity was dumb. And the good thing, though, is that I did care about the truth back then, even though I would, I cared more about being right than getting the truth. But eventually this striving for the truth won out, thank God. And I was still an atheist until my conversion. Like, so even while I was in politics and all this stuff, before my moment of conversion when I was 17, I was still an atheist. And so I went through politics as an atheist as well. And I think it was just getting myself in communities that talked about intellectual sort of things that sort of got me into politics, because I really liked, like, this was 2018, 2019, I think. No, when I started getting into politics, it was like 2016, 2017. And so this was like the Trump phase. This is like, people love these feminists owned compilations, and I love these too. I love them, and I would just watch them for hours. And I wanted to be some sort of political commentator. I was a libertarian, and I really got invested in politics. And I don't know how much I've taken from that time, aside from learning how to read and learning how to get deep into specific thinkers and ideas, because I got really deep into the libertarians, like this guy named Murray Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe. These are like anarchist libertarians, but capitalists. They're anarcho-capitalists, and I really love this. I think it's a silly ideology now, but that was part of my history with politics. And it was through politics, specifically on Instagram, that I started getting interested in philosophy, because I met some people who were reading both politics and philosophy. And the first philosopher I ever read, based on the recommendation of a friend, was Friedrich Nietzsche. And I was pretty blown away by Nietzsche, and I really liked him. So yeah, that just got me into more modern philosophy. I never got really in, and still haven't really got into the ancients, unfortunately. I've read some Plato and Aristotle, but aside from that, I'm more read on modern philosophy. And that got me thinking more outside of sort of the thing about modern philosophy is it's really weird. And you'll hear this about like postmodernists and Derrida. If you'll read, like, just look up a passage from Derrida, and I can guarantee you that I could read it right now and probably wouldn't understand it. Maybe I could now because I'm starting to get more into Derrida. But if you just took a random philosopher and a random person, or anyone like me who hasn't read them, you probably won't understand it because they use jargon and they have different ways of thinking. And that was a good thing because it got me thinking out of sort of a strict materialism and a strict scientism that I just took as dogma since I was at least 12. And I think for most of my life, I I never, for me, it was always naturalism, just pure naturalism, or Christianity. For some reason, I can't explain why, but for me, naturalism was always a big temptation. I was never going to become like a deist, for example. I was never going to believe in a God but not pray to him. I'm not insulting people who do this. That just never was my mindset. It was either there is no transcendent, there is nothing higher than the material world, or there is, and there are implications for that that are religious in nature. So it was through engaging with these modern philosophers with their weirder ideas that I started becoming more open to different forms of thinking. And specifically, I started to see how, just on a philosophical level, people like Richard Dawkins, they're not good philosophers, right? Like Richard Dawkins is especially bad. There are some good new atheists, in my opinion, but it was seeing through sort of the philosophical incompetency of a lot of naturalists and materialists that helped me to open my mind towards maybe religion could be possibly true. Although until my moment of conversion, which was very, like, it was like an instant moment where I think the spirit just came to my heart and I was like, whoa, Christianity is true. Before that moment, I wasn't a Christian, even if I was warming up to it and I was starting to like appreciate the Bible. Not like before, when I was 12, I'd be like, oh, the Bible, why read it? It's just a bunch of lies, old myths. I started reading it more. Like I got into Carl Jung a bit, and I started seeing it as deeper and having relevance to today and to philosophy and all this stuff. So that was really important for me. That's the most important thing I would say about modern philosophy, is that even though it's weird, the weirdness got me out of my very strict scientism and naturalism that had been the basis of my atheism for my whole conscious life, basically.
Right, right. And I know for a lot of guys that come into the Orthodox Church, at least in like the last handful of years, Jordan Peterson has played a large part. Was he on your radar at all when you were going through this?
Jordan Peterson. Yeah, but he was never as impactful as other people were, for sure. Like I just knew him as a figure who is like adjacent to the type of stuff I was interested in, like the culture war stuff, politics, and philosophy as well. But no, I never really got that deep into Peterson. I'm just trying to think of who would have been my biggest people at this time. Politically, I really liked Ben Shapiro. Not so much anymore, but um yeah, I'm just trying to think. It was less larger people, and honestly more people just close in my community, friends I would talk to, and YouTubers. I love talking to YouTubers because I learned so much from YouTube. I've done a lot more listening to YouTube about philosophy than actually reading philosophy. So yeah, but Jordan Peterson, no, not particularly for me.
And then when you eventually encountered the Orthodox Church, or when Christianity more broadly became a live option in your mind, I mean, talk us through a little bit about that, but also if you had to summarize the reasons why you decided to pursue the Orthodox Church and eventually
Hmm.
join it.
Well, so as I said, I had this moment of just conversion, and it was very like unique to me because I was trying to work through a philosophical idea I had got to, and a problem just emerged, and I'd been dealing with this problem, and just all of a sudden, the idea of the Trinity came to me, and it solved the problem for me. So that was my moment of conversion. Um, but what's interesting about that is that it was an intellectual conversion. I said before that like the spirit came into my heart, and I think he did in a real way. But it was an intellectual conversion and not a conversion of the heart. I wanted to, in my mind, become Christian, and I thought it was true for weeks. But I have distinct memories of praying the Jesus prayer and not believing what I was saying. Um, but doing it anyways. So that would be my recommendation. Not that I can give spiritual advice, but as someone who has experience with this, if you have like feel like you should get into Christianity, you need to pray. And if you're going to pray, like, just stick with it. That would be my suggestion, because I easily could have gave up, and who knows, I may not be a Christian today. But for various reasons, I can't remember exactly, I felt the need to keep praying. And I would pray. I try to do like a prayer rule and pray the Jesus prayer, even though I didn't believe it. Eventually the faith came. And that's when I started to attend St. Herman's. So to get to the reasons for why I chose Orthodoxy, well, for me, I wouldn't say that I had like a very rigorous look into the different denominations. But Protestantism never really worked with me, just for some foundational issues. Apostolic succession. I really disagree with Protestant soteriology and the understanding of Christ's atonement and all this stuff. I'm using Protestant in a very broad term here. I know that different Protestants believe different things, but in generally speaking, it was that, and wanting to have some foundation in history, in the historical church. That was very important for me. And I think from a convert perspective, it just seems like it should be important. Like, Jesus established a church. Let's find the church that has historical continuity there. And I don't even think Protestants have a claim to that. Unless you really want to undermine what the church is and make it some mystical idea of all believers, which is something that has happened. And I think it's sort of a logical consequence of Protestant ecclesiology. But Protestantism never really was a big issue for me. I do have a lot of respect for many Protestant theologians. I've learned so much from, especially from Protestant biblical theologians, specifically people like Peter Leithart, who's a big name in the Reformed community, James B. Jordan, who was his teacher. Their work to me is very orthodox in a way they don't really understand, and just brilliant in my mind when it comes to biblical stuff. So I've learned a lot from Protestants, but at the time, there were just so many reasons for me not to become Protestant that I decided that's not even really an option for me. So really the only option was between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And I remember I found this channel that a lot of people inquiring into Orthodoxy and looking into it versus Catholicism will find, by these people called the Diamond Brothers. Their channel is called Vatican Catholic. And I'm sure you know who like true Orthodox people are, genuine Orthodox. They're schismatics for Orthodox. Do you know who they are?
No, go ahead. Give us the definition.
True Orthodox are generally, you'll find them in Greece, or they stem from Greece, and they're hyper rigorous, Father Lawrence would call them fundamentalists. Their big problem in the 20th century was, one, the way the Soviet government treated Orthodox Christians. So a lot of fair grievances there. And then also ecumenism. So they're very, very, very anti-ecumenical. They see it as a heresy that has infected the whole church. So true Orthodox they call themselves Orthodox, but they've schismed from us. These people, the Diamond Brothers, who I found, these are the true Orthodox of the Catholic world. They're called Sedevacantists, and they believe that because of the ecumenism primarily, so they're very similar to the true Orthodox, because of the ecumenism since Vatican II, because of the liberalism that is fair enough, it's in the Catholic Church right now, they see the Catholic Church as apostate, and the Roman Pope as the Pope not as a true Pope. And I think they believe they're popeless at the moment, and they believe they're in the end times. Very common belief for fundamentalists like this. They made these videos on Orthodoxy, and they're very good at quote mining church fathers and all this stuff. So the filioque and papal prerogatives became the two main issues for me. I think they're the two main issues in general when it comes to East-West debate. And they made a convincing case for me. Oh, also against the essence energy distinction. They made a good case in my mind at the time for Thomism, for papal infallibility and papal authority, and the filioque. And for a few weeks, I was struggling with that. But there was one person who did change my mind and convinced me of Orthodoxy, and it was a guy named Seraphim Hamilton. And he has, in my opinion, the best Bible-related YouTube channel ever. He is fantastic. He's also Orthodox. And he made a series of videos on why I can't be a Roman Catholic, where he outlined sort of fundamental disagreements we have. Ones worth noting are papal understanding of the Catholic Church, and the Filioque. There are also other disagreements, but these are the two main ones. And he made very solid arguments for me that changed my mind. So, for example, at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, the Pope of Rome, named Vigilius, he tried to accept the theology of called the Three Chapters theology. Now, the East and Saint Justinian, the emperor, had already condemned this theology of the Three Chapters as being Nestorianizing. So it was already condemned. Now, Pope Vigilius, this is very crucial, and not many people know this for some reason. He tried to invoke his authority as the Pope of Rome, as the first of the bishops, which is a title we can grant. It's all throughout the early centuries. He tried to use his primacy, and again, we Orthodox, we believe in papal primacy, properly understood. He tried to use that to enforce his acceptance of the theology of the Three Chapters against the consensus of the council. And he was rejected for this. They didn't let him do that. And they gave a precise reason why. They said that from the time of the apostles, whenever there were disputes over the matters of the faith, the bishops would come together in council, and they said, this is the only way. I can quote it now because I've read it so many times, but this is the only way in which the truth can be made manifest. A conciliar context in council, this is the only way that matters of the faith, when there are discussions on matters of the faith, this is the only way the truth can be manifest. So in the at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which I believe is 6th or 7th century, 6th century, I think, there is the Pope of Rome trying to make a unilateral decision on behalf of the church related to matters of the faith. Remember, Vatican I says that the Pope has the authority to make statements that are infallible on matters of faith and morals. So on matters of the faith, he tried to do something against the consensus of the church, and they rejected him. The Byzantine Empire actually imprisoned him. I don't think they should have done this, but they treated him not really well. But the point is, he was rejected for trying to do what Vatican I says the Pope has the authority to do. Now, the crucial point is that the Fifth Ecumenical Council is accepted as dogmatic by both Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. That just means that there is a contradiction in Catholic dogma between Vatican I and the Fifth Ecumenical Council. I think there are more contradictions than that. But that, I think, is the most glaring one when it comes especially to this issue of papal infallibility. So I think that what is declared dogma at Vatican I is, given the history, is false. And I think they made historically false statements about the ecclesiology of the church. Because even if more modern Catholic scholars will claim that, oh, there's doctrinal development, ecclesiological development, that's not what Vatican I said. Vatican I said that we believe this is the teaching of the church from the earliest times. That's what they were saying. So I think Vatican I made an error. And for that reason alone, I can't be a Roman Catholic. So that was the argument really that sealed the deal for me, because it was just so clear, such a clear contradiction within Catholic dogma.
Right. And so when you joined the Orthodox Church, did you find a point where your heart started sort of catching up to your mind and there was a reintegration that occurred?
Yeah, well, I think it happened before I think I started believing in my heart before I became a catechumen. But yeah, I think it's still ongoing, really, like this process of bringing my mind to my heart. I know Saint Theophan the Recluse talks about this a lot. Not that I can in any way sort of match whatever he would have been describing with his mind going to his heart. But the way Father Lawrence describes it is, well, the heart in the Bible and in the church fathers, this is sort of the seat of your personhood, and you engage with other people. This is a crucial part. You engage with other people in your heart. When you love someone, they're in your heart and you're in their heart, right? There's this idea of your heart extends beyond yourself to encounter and embrace the other people and ultimately God. So when we're talking about the head going to your heart, the way Father Lawrence interprets it is, when you're praying, and I'm sure you've experienced this, that seems to be when your mind wants to do the most racing about mundane things that don't really matter. But when you're praying, you're supposed to be in the direct presence of God. You're supposed to have a dialogue with God, heart to heart, right? So this, I think, is what it means for your mind to descend into your heart. And so, yes, I do think I've gotten much better from when I was just becoming a Christian at praying, and in knowing how to pray in a way that isn't just saying stuff, whether it be my words or in my head, but actually engaging with God as a person. So learning to understand that God is a person and truly experiencing him as a person is, well, in my estimation, is an essential aspect of the spiritual life, and I'm living it to the best of my ability. Well, that's not true, but I'm doing I'm doing what I can with faith in Christ and assurance of His mercy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, and previously I liked your emphasis on just doing the action, regardless of how
Yeah.
you may or may not be feeling, because
Mhm.
that's great advice for anyone that in all sorts of relationships, there are times where you don't feel like doing something, but if you are able to perform the action, that will lead your heart in that direction. And that's what you actually have control over. And I think that that is why Christ told us to love even our enemies. Like we can
Yeah.
still will their good and act in a way that is loving towards them. It doesn't mean that we have rosy feelings about them
Yeah.
per se,
Yeah.
which is nice
Exactly.
because the feelings are harder to control.
Yeah.
So after you joined the Orthodox Church or along the way, were there certain challenges that you had to overcome? Like maybe when you're investigating it, there's certain things that are coming up and you think, well,
Hmm.
I'm not sure if I agree with that or this. And
Hmm.
then now that you've been Orthodox for a little bit, have there been other things that you've had to overcome?
No, in terms of like the theology or like the intellectual basis of orthodoxy, surprisingly, for me, just because of the way I think, I have had no problems with Orthodox theology, really. I've never had any serious doubts, and I think that's a relatively unique experience. I know, like the person I mentioned before, Seraphim Hamilton, he went through years of doubting. He was a Christian originally, not Orthodox, but he went through years of intense doubt, and that helped him to become who he is now. Um, but for me, I never really had any problems with doubt. Now, I have had like more personal, I guess, spiritual problems and um, just stuff I've had to deal with. I don't think anything crazy, every Christian has struggles, every person has struggles. So I've experienced my struggles in a specifically Christian context, and yeah, but in terms of like struggling over matters of the faith, never really a problem to me. Not to say there won't be in the future, but I have intellectually, at least, I've been quite convinced of orthodoxy from nearly the beginning of me discovering it.
And what was it like in terms of starting to attend a parish regularly? Because it sounds like throughout the journey, there was a lot of online activity
Yeah,
and like engagement with the mind, and it's not necessarily as intimate and close as going to a
right.
parish and interacting with people. So was that somewhat of an adjustment?
Yeah, and I mean, it was a little intimidating at first. I'm not naturally a very social person at all. I remember the first person I saw when I when I went to St. Herman's. We were still doing outdoor liturgies because it was COVID. This is like, guess when would it have been? 2020. Oh, I guess I got my Anyways, I got my dates before wrong, but it doesn't matter, like, my age. In any case, this would have been 2020 in the summer. So this is in the middle of COVID when I first started attending St. Herman's, and the first person I saw was, Father Simeon, at the time, still deacon, and he's just this large tower. You interviewed him, that's why I'm mentioning him. He's like a large, intimidating figure, and he was the first person I saw. I was like, "Hi, I came to see Father Lawrence," and he's just points me in the direction. And Father Lawrence, on the other hand, he is much less intimidating than Father Simeon, just like staring at them. They're both really great priests and great men. But yeah, just getting involved, especially because it was so small at the time, because we were in COVID cohorts. Father Lawrence was doing the best he could. And we because there was so few people, you had to talk with people, and people you may not like. I didn't know anyone, but like who knows if people even your age would be there. So I met a lot of people. Everyone is super nice there. And though, yeah, in terms of like adjustments for my life, not really, honestly. Like my family doesn't come to church with me, so I just go every Sunday and stuff. And I just started doing that, and they were always fine with that. They were always very, very supportive of that. And I feel like I'm still relatively new to St. Herman's. A lot of converts have come. since then, new people, and people have left, but I'm still feel like I'm getting into the community more and more. I'm still meeting people every time, or forgetting people's names and then reintroducing myself and all this. But I'm blessed to have a really, really good community with a really, really good priest, Father Lawrence Farley, who you also interviewed, actually. And yeah, so I don't have any complaints or any horror stories or anything from my experience at the parish. But what you said about the transition from the internet to the parish is very important. And I think I'll just mention it just for people who may be watching. Don't learn everything about Orthodoxy from the internet. It's not possible. Orthodoxy is an experience. Everyone says this, but it's true. That's why everyone says it. To actually know what it means to be an Orthodox Christian is to be attending liturgy and to experience how we worship and how we meet God, because that should be your goal. If you're becoming Orthodox, is because you want to know God, you want to be in a relationship with God, and you want to be in the community of people who have found God. So if you believe that, you should become Orthodox, but you need to be a part of the community, a part of the communion, right? Because Christianity is not an isolating thing. It's not something you can do alone. If God himself doesn't exist alone, but if he is the communion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, how much more are we created in his image, in need of being in communion with others as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if it's possible to do it in a summarized fashion, but you kind of spoke about the notion of the Trinity as a breakthrough point in your own journey out of solipsism, if I'm remembering correctly. And do you want to just walk us through some of the details of how the doctrine of the Trinity got you out of that?
Sure. Well, the real problem was, well, I never was a solipsist philosophically. I always didn't know how to get out of it as a philosophical problem, but I wasn't convinced of it until when I was 16 or 17. I took a bunch of psilocybin mushrooms with my friend, and we had a good day together. And then I was still being affected by them, and he had to go home, so I was left alone. And I remember I was in my own neighborhood, but I got lost, because that's what shrooms kind of do. Don't suggest them for people, especially because I do think you actually, if you believe in spiritual realities, it's not just an innocent thing to do. I do think you can encounter actual spiritual entities that aren't necessarily benevolent on high levels of psychedelic drugs. But when I did it, I didn't encounter any entities. But when I was walking alone, I just felt this crushing sense of isolation, and the feeling that because I am the center of my world, no one else can be truly real. Everything is filtered through me. So it's all me. I'm alone. And it's a terrifying idea. And it was terrifying, especially when you're experiencing it on hallucinogens or psychedelic drugs, and you can't explain to yourself that that's silly, that obviously my grandma is real. But it was convincing to me and terrifying to me. And at that moment, I was already a Christian, like maybe a Christian in name only. And I hadn't had the moment of faith. But then the idea of the Trinity came to me when I realized that God is he is identity as such. He is the basis of all other identities. And the Father, even though he is the basis of all identity, he is never without his Son, and he only ever exists insofar as he is also united with his Son. So the Father never has a moment that I'm having. And I was a Christian, so I believe this intellectually, at least. I was working through it in my head. I'm saying, well, let's just say I'm like the Father. So not in the blasphemous sense, but just by analogy. I'm the Father, right? And because I'm created in his image, so there must be some analogy to God. Let's just say I am like God, and I know other people. Well, I could say, like right now, I am making the mistake in saying that I don't truly know other people because they're always filtered through me. But that's just an idea in my head. If I truly believe I'm made in the image of God, and my identity is based in the identity of God, well, why shouldn't I believe that instead of me always being isolated, I'm always already in communion with other people? And when I believe I'm isolated, this is just my own sinful thinking in my own head, where like I remember even telling myself, how dare you say that your family doesn't exist when you're going to go home and your mom's going to make you dinner and all this stuff. I was like almost like a penitent at this point. Like, how dare you think this? This is wrong. And the reason why I could think it was wrong is because I got out of this philosophical circle of solipsism just by recognizing that I need to get away from my own identity and think about what is the foundation of my identity and who is the foundation of my identity. And if I truly believe that it is God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and I know that the Father and the Son and the Spirit are always together, and that He created me in their image, why should I believe in this solipsism I'm experiencing? And that was the only thing that saved me. It wasn't like, it didn't comfort me in like a very deep sense at the time, but it gave me enough to realize I may be wrong and I may be thinking stupidly here. And that's what got me out of that. And that experience aside, just the notion that identity as such, that the very essence of identity is communion, which is something really the whole basis of my channel now. It's emphasizing communion and a communal metaphysics and stuff like this. If identity, what identity is intrinsically, it cannot be separated from communion, then the risk of solipsism is not there. It's only a risk if I trick myself into it, which again, this is why before I was saying there's a real spiritual sense in which solipsism has value as an idea. Is because you can trick yourself into it, and you'll go to hell. Like, that's what hell ultimately is, I think, is this abyss of self-isolation. I don't know how easy it is to do this without drugs, but especially on these sort of mind-altering drugs, you can get to, or at least from my experience, and I've read like Reddit posts, people talking about their trips and stuff. They'll talk about similar things, like you're stuck in a time loop, you're stuck in yourself, you're stuck in this repetition. Well, this repetition, this inability to escape yourself, is the essence of what it means to be isolated from God, because only in a relation to God can you truly leave yourself and truly enter into the fullness of life that exists outside of the darkness of your own self-isolation.
Mm-hmm. And I want to be respectful of our time, so we're going to go to the last question.
I did have a, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, well, here's my devil's advocate question then. So
sure.
Within that, like, I think I agree with you in the sense that evidently solipsism does not work as a way to live one's life, and the doctrine of the Trinity is a much better starting point and first principle to have.
Yeah.
But if I was playing devil's advocate, I would ask, how do you know if you're in the solipsism or a solipsistic state of mind? How do you know and trust that the notion of the Trinity isn't just a trick in a way? Like, you have all these illusions around you, so why is this one not an illusion?
Right. And I think I said it at some point. I don't know if from a philosophical perspective, solipsism can be refuted. And this is why, because it has to do with the nature of solipsism and the nature of the human mind and the nature of human rationality. I've talked about this before. I'm going to try to give a concise version of it, but the problem of solipsism is a problem of self-reference, of self-relation, of trying to ground your identity in yourself as opposed to in God. So this is a self-relating view of the self versus a Christian communal view of the self. Now, within the self-relating perspective view of the self, and your self-relating rationality, I don't think there is a way to prove that solipsism isn't true, because I think the very method of rationality, or the structure of rationality, when it is not energized by faith, inherently leads to solipsism, actually. I think that because it's a self-referential understanding of reality, it ultimately has to collapse in the subject, or in the self, in the isolated self, when taken to its logical conclusion. Now, the precise reason why I think solipsism can't be refuted philosophically is because you can argue your way down to philosophy, to solipsism using philosophy. I can say, how do I know you are real? You're in my mind. Like, how do I know this isn't just an illusion? How, as you said, how do I know the idea of the Trinity isn't just an illusion? From a philosophical perspective, from a self-referential perspective, I don't think there's any way to get out of this problem, because it was through the means of rationality without faith, philosophy without theology. This got us to the problem of solipsism, of self-reference in the first place, because solipsism is only the fullest version, or the fullest logical conclusion of self-referentialism. So I don't think there is a way to philosophically prove that solipsism isn't true. And this is why a leap of faith is necessary. You need to exit your rationality. You need to, I call it the humility of rationality. Faith is the humility of rationality, where you get this weird paradox where the very faculty of knowing, rationality, has to openly admit it's unknowing, before the infinity of God. And this, I think, is the essence of apophatic theology. This is how Demetrius Stenaloy explains it in his Experience of God series. It's before the person of God, the infinite triune communion. We are silent because we know that nothing that we come up with in our heads can adequately describe what is outside of our heads. Instead, we need to let who is currently outside become interior to us. And this is deification. And this is true union with God. And this is why faith is necessary, because if you understand rationality as your head going around in circles, and ultimately I can go in enough circles to the point where I have doubted you, I've doubted my table, I've doubted everything, and it's just me alone. You can reach this point. And I think you can. A lot of people do in their spiritual life. There are philosophies that will argue down to this. I'm talking specifically Pavel Florensky's The Pillar and Ground of the Truth. His whole thing is getting down to this abyss of the self-isolated hell. And at this moment, Florensky realizes, well, from a philosophical perspective, we've reached a dead end. We're not getting out of this problem. Why doesn't philosophy have this moment of humility where it recognizes, well, maybe the reason I can't come out of this dead end is because I'm inherently incomplete. And the only way for rationality to truly become itself, to truly become the faculty of knowing, is if it first submits itself in the same way Christ humbles himself on the cross, in this moment of faith for rationality. And then subsequently, with the new revelation that you take on faith, you can use this revelation, you can use the dogmas of the church to do true philosophy, which I think inherently becomes true theology. It naturally leads to that. So to summarize, I don't think solipsism can be refuted on the basis of philosophy, because solipsism is the result of philosophy without faith, or philosophy without theology. But if you have a true leap of faith and you accept even just a leap of faith in your existence, that is a true leap of faith, because it's recognizing something that fundamentally I cannot prove just in my own head. I need to take your otherness, what you are. I need to take it and accept it. I need to accept you for as the gift from God that you are. So this is, I talk about this in a book I'm writing right now, but the structure of the gift and how all of reality is a gift. And in order to receive a gift, the first thing you need to recognize is that it's not yours. You need to receive it from another. So even the gift of our own existence, we don't have it in ourselves as something that we have by right or we have by nature. No, our nature is created. So to receive the fullness of our being is to receive it as a gift from God. This is what Maximus talks about, moving from just your being to your well-being to your eternal being. It involves becoming more united with God, receiving more of what God has to give. And ultimately what God has to give is himself. So God is the ultimate gift to us. So it's by understanding that reality is inherently a gift. All knowledge is inherently a gift. It's a gift of God, or even just a gift of you, but it's always God, obviously, who would be the first principle, the first cause in any relationship at all. But this requires faith. So I think faith is intrinsic, is necessary to complete rationality, because rationality by itself can't even account for its own self. So you need to have a leap of faith, a moment of accepting God, accepting revelation. And that involves transcending your own rationality.
Okay. I'm going to give one little brief response, and
sure,
you can let me know what you think of it. But when I've encountered solipsism before, or like had a discussion with someone, the kind of argument I had against it, which I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are, is you don't necessarily prove first principles, you prove by first principles. And so there's sort of a inversion that's happening with solipsism, where you're trying to prove the first principles, and that we know that things exist because of our sensate data. Like, we interact with things that come into existence and go out of existence. And it's illogical to, at one point, hold that existence is a thing that we can know based on that sensate data, and simultaneously doubt the sensate data. Right. That's my argument against solipsism. I don't know if it's philosophically valid, but it seems to work when I was arguing with someone.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it kind of depends on who you're talking with, because I do think there's a way out of this, and it's just a much more radical, like, sort of I was going to say arrogant, but more so just like uncompromisingly solipsistic worldview, where you could even say, "Well, I don't even accept sense data at all, and I don't even accept that I'm talking to you right now. I think you're a projection in my mind, and I'm just engaging with it, and there's nothing you can do to prove that wrong." Now, when you get to like presuppositional levels, can you make an argument like a presuppositionalist argument against solipsism? Maybe I don't know. Like there might be a way you can show how solipsism is inherently logically impossible. I'm not fully sure. Only because I almost see it as like trying to philosophically prove that hell doesn't exist. Like I can prove to you that hell is bad, that hell is wrong, that there is something false about hell, obviously. But at the same time, it's a possibility, it's a potential within free beings. So that's I more like to see solipsism less as a even though I less is just an abstract philosophical theory, which we can analyze and deconstruct, which I'm not going to say it's impossible to do, and more so as a spiritual state, which you can fall into and be taken out of. That's just my own personal way of looking at it. But yeah,
Yeah, definitely. So, in conclusion, do
yeah.
you have any advice for people that are interested in Orthodoxy that might not currently be part of the church?
Watch telosbound on YouTube. No, I'm kidding. But you can watch people on YouTube. Like maybe my first advice would be to go to church, but I think first you need to learn what Orthodoxy is. But if you're already inquiring, I guess you do know. But I'll just say from my personal experience, lots of good stuff you can learn on YouTube, especially Sarah from Hamilton. There's other people too, but you can learn the basics. You can learn the history, especially of the church and of various theological debates and all this stuff. I think that's important. But aside from that, because I don't feel confident to give any other advice, I would just give the standard advice: go to church and experience what it means to be an Orthodox Christian. And um, yeah, because Orthodoxy is inherently liturgical, and it's in liturgy that we meet God. So again, the whole point of becoming Orthodox should be to find the truth, who is God, and to have a personal communion with Him. The only way you can do that is through going to church in the liturgy, because that is the how Christ established the church, and how He established the means of worship and of engaging with Him in a legitimate uh, manner as his apostles, as his followers, as Christians. So that would be my advice to people.
Well, that is a wonderful place to conclude. So, I
Yeah.
want to thank you for your time, Treydon. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks so much, Max. I really enjoyed it.
Hey guys, thanks for checking out that episode of the Orthodox Christian Podcast. If you have a question about Orthodox Christianity, there is a link in the video description below that you can check out that will take you to a Google form. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, I would ask you to please share it with one friend or family member, or if you haven't yet, please subscribe. And in the meantime, I hope that you have a peaceful week. Take care.